Now, Bernie Sanders recently wrote a letter to the Democratic National Committee, essentially asking them to choose the standing committees that will determine the rules and the platform for the Democratic Party. He wanted them to make some more fair choices. Now, Sanders said in a letter that 2 appointees who had already been named are, quote, aggressive attack surrogates on the campaign trail for Hillary Clinton. Now, one of them is former Massachusetts Representative Barney Frank. Now, Barney Frank, according to the International Business Times, sits on the board of directors of a major bank that was recently named in a lawsuit about an alleged Ponzi scheme. Oh, great. So there's one of the guys who's actually going to be on the DNC platform committee, making the entire platform for the Democratic Party. Great. Now, Barney Frank has also publicly boasted about money that he's taken from Wall Street while he was in Congress. Now, I said he sits on the board of a big bank, right? This bank is Signature Bank. They're about a 15-year-old institution that boasts about $33 billion in assets and turned a record profit last year of about $373 million. Now, of the $18,000 the bank donated to congressional candidates during Frank's last election, he ended up getting $2,400, almost the maximum donation according to data from the Center for Responsive Politics. Now, wait a minute, you might say. I thought he was instrumental in the Dodd-Frank bill. Remember, Frank. That Barney Frank is the Frank in Dodd-Frank. Interesting, right? Now, you might have heard maybe from Hillary Clinton that Dodd-Frank was historic banking reform. You've also probably heard that from Barack Obama. Now, he helped get this signature legislation passed that was supposed to regulate the banks. Historic regulation, Barack Obama said. Well, if he was that much of an enemy to the banks, why did he suddenly end up on the board of one such bank? Well, I got an answer for you. It's called the revolving door. And Barney, well, he jumped right in it. He revolved away. Now, look, we know that Dodd-Frank is actually super weak legislation, right? It's weak regulation. It doesn't even split up the banks as a 21st century Glass-Steagall would. It didn't involve that. And it also hasn't even stopped giant banks from getting bigger and posing a systemic risk like before the crash of '08. In fact, the banks are larger and more dangerous. They're more powerful. That's not a good thing. That's not historic reform. That's crap. And also, regulators and Republicans especially have chipped away at the protections in Dodd-Frank. It was weak and watered down to begin with. And then they just poured a bucket on it, making it even weaker so that the banks can get bigger and more powerful. That's fucking great. Now back to Barney Frank and how much money he got from the banks. Between 1989 and his retirement in January 2013, Barney Frank received more than $1 million worth of campaign donations from the securities and investment industry, according to CRP data. More than a third of that cash haul came during the 2010 election cycle, when Barney Frank was involved in creating Dodd-Frank. Interesting, right? Now, here's another thing about Barney Frank that's kind of a hypocritical statement. Back in 2012, Frank told NPR that donations from banks or industries to a candidate do influence those in positions of political power. Quote, people say, oh, it doesn't have any effect on me. Well, if that were the case, we'd be the only human beings in the history of the world who on a regular basis took significant amounts of money from perfect strangers and made sure that it had no effect on our behavior. But now, since he's taking money from Wall Street and working on Wall Street and supporting Hillary Clinton, who says that she's apparently inhumanly immune to the influence of getting big money donations from Wall Street, big pharma and giant multinational corporations, he's changed his tune. Funny that. In December, actually, he wrote an op-ed in Politico titled, quote, yes, I took bank money and it made me a better regulator. That title right there. Yes, I took corporate money and that made me better at regulating the industry because they gave me money. Does that make any sense to you? It doesn't make any sense to me. Part of that, he wrote, quote, over a 40-year career in elected office, I not only took contributions from the finance industry, I requested them. Hey, I'm your local regulator. I'm supposed to be making your rules. Give me money. Who does that? Oh, apparently Barney Frank does. He continues, since retiring 3 years ago, I have not only accepted fees from financial companies and finance groups, but I've solicited opportunities to do so through my agents. I've also served for 2 years on the advisory board of First Alliance, a company that deals with residential mortgages. Now, if you can remember, mortgages is what brought the economy down in 2008. So he's right back in the thick of it after accepting millions of dollars, or over $1 million in campaign bribes from the industry itself. Funny how that revolving door works, right? Especially to his benefit. And it's funny how his tune changes when him and his selected candidate are paid by essentially the same people. But of course he tries to downplay it by saying this, quote, by demonizing finance industry contributions, we're effectively insisting that instead of 80% of the industry's contributions going to opponents of regulation, it should be 95% or more. Is this money corrupting? In my own experience, it's more reasonable to see it as a form of political self-defense, unlikely to dilute their support for reform. Political self-defense. I'll get to that in a minute. But I got to ask, where's that reform? What did Dodd-Frank actually do? What does Hillary Clinton plan to do? Does she plan to go after AIG, like she says? The shadow banking industry, as she says? Well, I ask, why don't we go after the big fish first? The ones who, after the biggest recession since the Great Depression, have only increased in size and have been given license due to the right-wing SCOTUS to give unlimited amounts of money to political candidates that you even admitted, Barney Frank, gives those banks undue influence over the people that they give money to. Instead, you want to call this practice that you once went after, you want to call it a political defense mechanism. Well, I've got a different word for you, Mr. Frank. It's called hypocrisy. Look it up.